I received an email last month from a woman who was raised Catholic. She's now living in Israel. She moved there because she took a class in college on the Holocaust and became fascinated not with Jewish death, but with Jewish life, with Jewish culture, Jewish identity. She went to Israel. She loved it. She fell in love with a man and loves him, and they want to get married. But they can't get married there, even though his family is there, their friends are there. And so they found me in Chicago, and they're going to be coming there in a few weeks to celebrate their wedding. Now, Israel's marriage laws, as we know, as we've discussed, are ripe for revolution. But unless you want to wait the 400 years that Sivan predicted it would take to go through the Knesset, it's going to take a revolution. And the reality is, as Sivan has explained to me, this Jewish marriage revolution in Israel is already beginning. No Bastille, no storming. It's happening on the ground every day. When we contemplated putting together this colloquium, we talked about the future of Jewish community in evolution or revolution. I wasn't sure what the answer would be, but after this colloquium, I'm pretty sure it's revolution, ready or not. There's a wonderful book that came out a couple of years ago by Kerry Olitsky, the executive director of the Jewish Outreach Institute. It's called Playlist Judaism. He imagines that the revolution in Jewish organizational life actually began with the iPod, or even before that with Napster, which was the original site that got shut down. But the idea was this: you no longer have to buy an album and play the album in the order they want you to play it. You can take a song from one group and a song from another group and a song from a third group and put them in whatever order you want. Have it your way. And not on a list of 3 choices, 300 million choices. Well, if you can do that with your music, and you can do that on your computer, and you can do that walking or jogging or anything else that you're doing, and you get to Jewish life and they say, turn to page 72. Now turn to page 73. Now everyone say the same thing together. Well, then it changes. Or another book I read this past year by a friend of our movement, Arthur Blecker, in Washington, D.C., he wrote a very interesting book called The New American Judaism, where he describes how denominations were founded by a certain model. The suburban synagogue was founded for a certain population, and that as time changed, the old line is, all that is solid simply melts into air. Of course, the other realization we have, thinking about this future of Jewish community, is the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, who said there is nothing new under the sun. So you heard Paul Golan talk today about the panic over affiliation rates down to 33%. Do you know what affiliation rates were like in America in the 1920s and 30s? They were maybe 30%. They were very small. They increased tremendously in the post-war period, but we think now that's the way it always was, just because that's how many of us grew up. But that isn't the norm in American Jewish life, because there is no norm in American Jewish life. Well, those high affiliation rates were a product of their time and place. You see, we have to get used to revolutions because they happen all the time. I love what Sivan had to say about the need for revolution. We have to not only have a revolution in actual deeds when it comes to marriage, but in how we understand ourselves, how we understand our history, our culture, our reality today. It's a revolution in thought. How do you define being Jewish? Do you put a fence around the Jewish people like the ultra-Orthodox, build a higher and higher fence around the Torah? Maybe Jewishness can have multiple definitions: individual affirmation, definition by context, a personal definition like your own calendar of birthdays and anniversaries and yahrzeits. You see, our reality needs to change our conceptions. The reality today is that the majority of Jews marry non-Jews. The reality is that the holiday of Shavuot, the holiday of Purim, the stories of Ruth and Esther are stories of interethnic marriage. The reality is that elder education may be as important as youth education, and elder education is a route to youth education and identity. Intermarriage can be a good thing. It can increase the Jewish family, increase the number of households with a Jewish member in it, spreading knowledge about Jewish life even farther. It also has the benefit of what I call deepening the gene pool. You see, Jews marrying Jews is like Amish marrying Amish. It creates a problem. We need to deepen the gene pool. Also, most importantly, we affirm the reality by celebrating intermarriage that Jewish history has always been a culture of plurality. Judaism has always been a culture of plurality. And for some of us, we've taken the next step to having an ideology of pluralism. You see, we have to remember, even the Hebrew god Yahweh once had a Canaanite goddess wife. It's not simply the Jewish tradition, or even Sherwin's theory of the tradition and an underground radical humor and skepticism tradition. The second temple in Jerusalem was at least the fifth Jewish temple, probably more if you count all the other shrines that were out there. She challenged what counts as a mixed marriage. Well, the reality is we've always had them. Go back to our literary past, through our early history into today. The people who wrote stories about an intermarrying Abraham, intermarrying Joseph and Moses and David and Solomon, whether or not those people actually lived, the people who wrote the stories wrote it that way because they knew it was happening. Samson's parents complained about Delilah. You sure you can't meet a nice Jewish girl? Well, again, nothing is new under the sun, says Ecclesiastes. There's a very simple proof of the history of intermarriage. Picture in your mind a Jew from Yemen. Picture in your mind a Jew from India. Picture in your mind a Jew from Poland, a Jew from Algeria. They don't look the same. And it's not because of the climate. It's not because of the food or the water. It's because they met people and they married people. One unintended result of this colloquium is that we had a history of intermarriage. From that earliest biblical literature, through the conflict between the welcoming Ruth and the exclusionary Ezra, through the evolution of the phenomenon in the United States throughout the 20th century. You see, we forget. Evolution is a revolution. It's not just a conceptual change to accept that things are different, and maybe even were different all along. But the accumulation of gradual change adds up to a radical change. You see, Jewish identity used to be everything, 100%. Your ethnicity, your language, your culture, your beliefs, your geography, your family, your food, your community. You were Jewish in all of those points of contact. In fact, one of the reasons that secular Jews over 100 years ago wanted to create a Jewish state was they saw what was happening in Europe with acculturation, even assimilation. They feared the consequence of that 100% spiraling downward less and less and less Jewish. First you speak English, then you eat their food, then you go to college with their children, and then. So they said, let's create a revolution in Jewish identity, a secular national Jewish state where they will speak a Jewish language, live by the Jewish calendar, be raised on Jewish literature, and be surrounded by Jews. So it won't even matter if traditional rabbis do the wedding, since Jews are going to marry Jews. And today, well, we heard from Sivan, 1 in 10 partnerships in Israel, maybe 100,000 couples, is intercultural or interfaith, even if more of them are cross-cultural between Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Jews. 60% of the Israeli public is still opposed to intermarriage, more than in the U.S., if you ask the survey. Well, if the Jewish organizations listen to the people, that is. We'll have to talk about that in a moment. But that 60% opposition is less than it used to be. There are large numbers of these so-called mixed families that are reverse assimilated, opposite assimilated into Jewish culture. And Israelis themselves are not cut off from the world. They are not 100% Jewish. They are part of world culture. You can read any world literature translated into Hebrew. Israelis have assimilated Western concepts of human rights and values. There is a technical Hebrew term for email that nobody uses because the Academy came up with the term and everybody writes in Hebrew letters email. That's it. My first trip to Israel, I remember seeing a huge record store. You may remember record stores before that playlist revolution. There was a huge record store, and in Hebrew letters it said Tower Records. And I thought to myself, well, they could easily say Taklite Migdal. I mean, they could easily translate Tower Records into Hebrew, but they simply wrote the English words in the Hebrew letters because that outside culture was influencing things. There are thousands and hundreds of thousands of Israelis living abroad who are connected to their Israeliness, but also to American life and culture, and certainly their children. So what about that Jewishness of the pie chart, that 100%? Is that percent of Jewishness spiraling down and down, even in Israel, but also in America? The irony we found, and this turns to Karen's presentation, is that sometimes intermarriage becomes the inspiration to deepen one's Jewish connection. Now that I'm responsible for knowing and doing something, now I have to actually know something and do something. And that realization, as much as secular humanistic Judaism has been doing things right with officiating and co-officiating wedding ceremonies, creating welcoming and accepting communities, we still need to give our members and our children the confidence that they can be the masters of their own Jewish fate, the captain of their neshamas, their Jewish identities. Now, Karen was clearly an unabashed advocate of revolution. She said we need a revolution in how we do what we do and in how we think about ourselves. We have to change what we think about the possibility of an abiding Jewish identity after intermarriage. We know this truth in our movement, but now we understand more about the dynamic, this concept of the Jewish male mystique, or what I called tzuris without a name. The expectation to earn and provide, but also to give Jewish identity, requires engagement in parenting and children's lives, and how could you do both? Some traditionalists snidely suggest that, well, letting women count in the minyan, or letting women be on the board, or letting women be rabbis, has made Jewish men less interested. Well, those people have an axe to grind, but not a leg to stand on. It is not true that the only Judaism that will keep men Jewish is a chauvinist boys' club. I have higher liberated expectations for Jewish men, and by the way, so too do the non-Jewish women who want to date them on J-Date. The patrilineal revolution needs to continue and needs to take root. We also learned that the personal is political. That's from feminism, but here also the personal is demographic. Not just what we can learn from qualitative as well as quantitative studies, but also the motivation for behavior. At one time, anti-Semitism kept some Jews Jewish, but motivated other Jews to intermarry for integration and security. I told the story of Senator George Allen's mother, raised in Tunisia, father persecuted for being Jewish, said, I don't want any part of this. But Karen has many more stories like that in her research. It wasn't primarily the shiksagadis and sex that drove Jewish men to intermarry. It was what partners were available, what personal qualities did they have, and that unquantifiable subjective reality called falling in love. Now, Paul Golan also talked about a revolution. He tried to say both. But I think what Paul was saying under the ground is that the revolution is already here. The revolution has happened and we're just waking up. It's like Bastille Day +2, and we're all of a sudden realizing what happened. We can certainly work on incremental change, lowering barriers, public space events. That's part of that evolution approach. But we're also evolving away from those past models. The whole concept of how many people need to join, or do you need to identify with a denomination, that's a world that's changing. You see, we face a new norm. The new norm is that there are over twice as many households with one Jewish partner in it than there are households with two, 1.7 million versus 740,000. It's no longer radical to say you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish. They asked that question explicitly on Pew, and a large number said, not a problem. It's even not unusual to have only a third of people saying that being part of a Jewish community is essential to being Jewish for me. It's not just people in New York City. There's a lot of people in New York City, but it's not just people in New York City that feel that way. Some of us were not surprised with that Pew study saying that many identify as Jewish by ancestry or culture rather than by religion. In other breaking news, the sky is blue, and when it rains, you get wet. People like to do what they want, not necessarily what you want them to do. So if you want to reach them, you have to go where they are. You have to get out of the synagogue and out of the building, out of the Shabbat service. As Paul said, some will still want those things. There are millions of synagogue members at this very moment. The question is not just affiliation, but affinity. If we in secular humanistic Judaism want to be part of this revolution and not be swept aside, we need to go back to a Jewish tradition that has been too often forgotten. The halakhic principle of go out and see what the people are doing. That can define Jewish law and the Talmud. It can define our practice of Judaism too. We want to be hosts and not impose on our guests. We need to remember that when people are looking at a community, and this is another concept from JOI's training, people like to date before making a commitment. If you went out on the first date with someone and they asked you to move in with them on the first date, occasionally it works. But more often than not, you'll run away. Well, if someone comes to your building and you say, oh, are you interested in membership? That's like proposing on the first date. They don't even know you. So they need to be able to date you, to get to know you, to feel comfortable with you, to find they like what they found, to find people like them in your community. It's not a matter of membership. Do you want a membership packet? Do you want to find out about membership? No. I want to find out about you. I want to learn who you are. I've done it anonymously on your website, on your blog, on your podcast. I've taken a step already to walk in the door. Don't scare me away. Keep the door open. You see, Jews, we know, tend to be much more skeptical of religious belief than the general population. But we find, and Pew has shown us, that there are similar proportions of Jews who claim no religion. The general population for millennials and the Jewish population for millennials saying no religion is almost exactly the same. As Paul said earlier, as much as we like to claim we're different from everybody else, sometimes we're very much the same. Well, why is it that Jews are so secular? We didn't really talk about that, but I think it's easy to figure out. You see, Jews fit all the categories that make people be secular. Jews are urbanized and less rural. Jews go to college and graduate school. Jews are politically liberal, most. Jews are in the higher income brackets. Again, not all, but overrepresented. Jews are predominantly living in the blue states, not the red states. And Jews are second or third or fourth generation immigrants, or even more. And even their immigrants were former Soviets who were secularized there by force. So if you remember that people who are urbanized tend to be more secular, people who are college educated are more secular, people who are politically liberal are more secular, people who live in blue states are more secular, people who are second and third generation immigrants, well, no wonder, surprise, Jews are very, very secularized. And surprise, like most people, we marry those who we have more in common with us. Geography, college education, even comparable politics, as Karen mentioned in her research. So it's no wonder that we've been marrying people who are not Jewish, because they're more like us than other Jews. I've found in couples that I've met with for weddings, they'll say, we both went to the same high school. We both grew up in the same town. That's more important than whether one was Jewish or one was not Jewish. And even when Russian Jews marry each other, there are some now Russian Jews, young Jews, who are marrying people who are not Jewish. But I have to say a large number of Russian Jews are marrying Russian Jews. But it's always fascinating to see which ones want Russian in the wedding ceremony and which ones don't. Because some do. They're very connected to Russian language. It was very important for them to marry a fellow Russian Jew, and not just a fellow Jew, but a fellow Russian Jew, so they could do Russian. See, that's not Yiddish. It's Russian. That is their ethnic identifying language, that culture. Well, that's a dynamic, as Paul suggested, that may change going forward. We've already seen the revolution. We're in a brave new world now. The Jewish Forward wrote an article recently about the prevalence of non-Jews in synagogues. And the tone of the article was, oh, you mean I can't make any Yiddish jokes anymore? Oh, you mean I can't make any jokes about a Goyish Kopf and how silly they are anymore? As if he was mourning that fact. We want more non-Jews in the synagogue because it means their Jewish partners are there too. We want that result. It's here. You see, a conversionary push that says you have to convert to be Jewish. If you want to get married Jewish, you have to make the partner become Jewish. It denies the reality of personal history. It denies the reality of extended families because those grandparents aren't converting on the other side. And it pushes away couples who are seeking Jewish connection at a very important moment. And by the way, it makes religious identity a competition, not a collaboration. As we've said for years, if we want the non-Jewish partner to be open to Jewish identity in the family, then we have to be generous enough, self-confident enough, brave enough to let them celebrate the parts of their culture as we are asking to celebrate parts of ours. There are lots of signs for optimism if you want them. Feminism and Jewish feminism has encouraged Jewish women who intermarry to continue their cultural and religious identity. It's encouraged Jewish men to become more engaged in their children's identity formation. That's a plus plus. There's an increasing proportion, up to 61% of intermarried families, who are raising kids with some Jewish identity. That's up from past surveys and in the right direction. Now, freedom has its challenges. Some of those 61% raising children both religions and cultures, well, that possibility gives the heebie-jeebies to some people. But it's much more likely with an equal partnership model. Sometimes co-officiation at a wedding is for parents or nostalgia or culture, but sometimes they both have an active religious belief and they want that to continue, not just at the wedding. It may be that more assertive Christian wives, influenced by feminism, complicate a Jewish husband's desire to raise Jewish children. We didn't even explore the complexities of same-sex partnerships, which I understand also have a high frequency of intercultural pairings and their own dynamics for child rearing. Is half a Jew better than no Jewish identity at all? Well, Paul Golan challenged us at our last colloquium in 2012, our last full-length colloquium. The title of the colloquium was Half Jewish, ? The Heirs of Intermarriage. And Paul said, what does it mean to be 100% Jewish? Does that mean I have to do Jewish things all the time? Do I have to think Jewish all the time? I can't watch football? What are you telling me I can't do if I have to be 100% Jewish and you're saying someone else is half Jewish, 50%, 25%? What are we getting to these percentages for anyways? It sounds like the Nuremberg laws. What does it mean to be Jewish? How do we define it? Well, I'll give you an example. I asked an adult ed class in my congregation, what is Jewish food? And the answer I got was, whatever my mother made. Remember the person who wanted his house to smell Jewish because it was his mother's cooking? What makes you Jewish? It's whenever it enables you to claim that you are Jewish, if you want to be. It's not an accident that Jews of no religion were very strong in saying that what makes you Jewish is ancestry and culture, specifically ancestry. Think about those women who had become Unitarian, but who identified as Jewish by race or blood, or they identified in a way that allowed them to stay Jewish. Maybe it's sociological Jews who don't need a formal conversion. And we have them in our congregations too. I remember a few years ago an article in Huffington Post about a man who was getting divorced from his Jewish wife of 30 years, and he still wanted to go to Passover Seders. He was totally secular, non-theist, but he had no in anymore. His ticket was being revoked to Jewish life. And he said, I wish there were some way I could have a secular conversion. And we went, again. You see, our challenge is that our message isn't out there enough. I love the idea of a coalition for patrilineal Judaism or a coalition for Jewish ancestry Judaism. I was thinking of creating a manifesto or a platform for open Judaism with a lot of the principles. Well, it began to sound a little bit like the Big Tent Judaism commitments that Jewish Outreach Institute encourages congregations to make, but maybe even push a little more on the ideology. In the end, of course, if we want to be a movement, we have to be doing something. I love the fact that in Mexico, there is a party that has controlled the country for most of its independence. It's called the Institutional Revolutionary Party. The Institutional Revolutionary Party. In a state of permanent revolution. You see, we in humanistic Judaism are where large numbers of Jews are, whether the Jewish establishment is ready to face reality or not. In the year 2000, the American Jewish Committee did a study on Jewish American attitudes to a lot of issues. They do this every year. But in that year, in 2000, they asked questions about intermarriage. They found out that 80% of American Jews said that intermarriage is inevitable in an open society. That strong majorities, 60% plus, wanted rabbis to officiate or even co-officiate at wedding ceremonies. They never asked those questions again. And if you go to their website, you can dig around and find that survey. It's still there. But when you get to the section on intermarriage, only that section, the numbers are garbled. So it's hard to figure out. You can't easily make a chart out of it. You can't easily send someone as a link to that part of the site. It's the only survey that looks like that from what I've seen on their site. Is it an accident? A coincidence? Unlikely. That's the reality. The American Jewish people are far beyond where the institutions are, and we are closer to where they are. Now, as much as we lower barriers, go out to meet people where they are, develop our messaging, create internet content and YouTube videos like this very session, we also need to have something to say. We need to make a difference in people's lives. It comes back to where we started on Friday evening. Sales, sales, sales. Convincing people that this is worth it, that Jewish community, any Jewish community, our kind of Jewish community, is worth their time and attention and money and emotion and commitment. If we can sell them that secular humanistic Judaism is better than nothing, not just better than nothing, we're better than being nothing. If we can show Jews of no religion and Jews of both religions and Jews of their own religion that having a sense of roots and culture and connection can deepen and enrich their lives, then the Jewish future can be very bright. And so I want to end this colloquium with a reading. Some of you received this handout on the way in. If not, there are more on the way out. It's a poem by Yehuda Amichai, one of our favorites. It's called simply The Jews. But I think it gets at this powerful experience, a sense of roots, and I find that even reading this poem for me is one of those experiences I would share with someone else. The Jews. The Jews are like photos in a display window, all of them together, short and tall, alive and dead, brides and grooms, bar mitzvah boys and babies. Some are restored from old yellowed photographs. Sometimes people come and break the window and burn the pictures, and then they start photographing and developing all over again and displaying them again, sad and smiling. Rembrandt painted them wearing Turkish turbans with beautiful burnished gold. Chagall painted them hovering in the air, and I paint them like my father and my mother. The Jews are an eternal forest preserve where the trees stand dense and even the dead cannot lie down. They stand upright, leaning on the living, and you cannot tell them apart, just that the fire burns the dead faster. And what about God? God lingered like the scent of a beautiful woman who once faced them in passing and they didn't see her face, only her fragrance remained, kinds of perfumes. Blessed be the creator of kinds of perfumes. A Jewish man remembers the sukkah in his grandfather's home, and the sukkah remembers for him the wandering in the desert, that remembers the grace of youth and the tablets of the 10 Commandments and the gold of the golden calf and the thirst and the hunger that remembers Egypt. And what about God? According to the settlement of divorce from the Garden of Eden and from the temple, God sees his children only once a year, on Yom Kippur. The Jews are not a historical people, and not even an archaeological people. The Jews are a geological people with rifts and collapses and strata and fiery lava. Their history must be measured on a different scale. The Jews are buffed by suffering and polished by torments like pebbles on the seashore. The Jews are distinguished only in their death as pebbles among other stones. When the mighty hand flings them, they skip 2 times or 3 on the surface of the water before they drown. Some time ago, I met a beautiful woman whose grandfather performed my circumcision long before she was born. I told her, "You don't know me, and I don't know you, but we are the Jewish people. Your dead grandfather and I the circumcised, and you the beautiful granddaughter with golden hair, we are the Jewish people." And what about God? Once we sang, "There is no God like ours." Now we sing, "There is no God of ours." But we sing. We still sing. Thank you very much. Thank you all again for coming. Looking forward to seeing all of you to chat afterwards. And thank you again for hosting us for Colloquium 2014.
Thank you, Adam. Please stand up and applaud to Adam.